Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful. Kindle within us the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit that we might be recreated and renew the face of the church and the earth. Amen. Well, my name's Kevin Donlon, so a couple of disclaimers before I begin and the clock starts, because I got told about the timing. First of all, thanks for inviting me, Al Dayhoff, number one. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for all the sharing that went on. Bill, I really appreciated what you had to say yesterday for a lot of reasons, which I won't get into today, but thanks so much. And where's Pastor Purdy? Is he here? I wore a collar just for him. So I wanted to go out to him. But really, everybody, the sharing that went on and the intimacy, I really appreciate it, largely because, to use a Dayhoff quote, I'm not part of your tribe. So I appreciate the invite. And because I'm not part of your tribe, I come from this from a whole different angle. And so a couple of disclaimers. Number one, I've never planted a church. I don't know anything about it. I mean, I know about it, what I read, and I'm a bright guy and I can understand what I read. But I've never done it. I couldn't tell anybody job one about it. So when I hear you guys talk about it, I listen to it with admiration and amazement. I've been around church planting people the better part of the majority of my ministry, but I've never done it. I couldn't tell you about it, other than your stories that I hear and resonate with. Number two, I'm not a reform guy on any level. I know that's shocking dressed like this, but even as an Anglican, I'm not in on the reform side. I am a card-carrying Anglo-Catholic, have been a high churchman the entire time I've been in the church. Unlike a lot of you, I didn't come to the church from a different life. I entered seminary when I was 13 years old in the Roman Catholic Church. And I studied for the priesthood for 11 years in the Roman Church. Took a leave, taught for a while, and then came back as an Anglican and was ordained. So I've never been outside the church. Even when I took a leave, I taught theology at a Catholic high school. So I've never been outside the realm of the church. That's my second disclaimer. My third disclaimer is when I entered in 1970, as a 13-year-old young man, this may not mean any, I think you guys know movies, so you'll know this. Father O'Malley by Bing Crosby, Bells of St. Mary Going My Way. That's what I went into seminary to do. I went to go be Father O'Malley. And I came out when I was ordained in 1988, and that world didn't exist. And I spent a good part of my ministry trying to recreate that world. Even took a parish by the name of St. Mary's that had a school and was trying to bring nuns there to come staff it, Anglican nuns. So that didn't work out so well, but that's another story for another day. So those are all disclaimers. So everything I'm now going to say to you about this is counterintuitive to everything in my story, and may dovetail with a good part of yours, I think. But it will be a different language structure. It'll be a different dynamic, but if you can cross the tracks, I'm going to use that image today, if you can cross the tracks, you might be able to say, that's got some merit. I think you might be able to do that. The moment we're in, it's, lastly, I'm not an evangelist, and also I'm against evangelism. But I'm against any ism. Really, I think isms. My friend, who's a priest in the Church of England, Arthur Middleton, who taught church history at the University of Durham, he's saying I'm against any ism because isms are stagnant by definition. They don't move. So you have to try to find verbiage that makes it alive. So he calls, rather than call Anglicanism, for example, Anglicanism, he calls it the Anglican idea, because ideas are alive. So what I would say, let's move from evangelism to evangelization, because evangelization is about the act of doing it, okay? But I really couldn't speak with expertise on that, so I just called it Missiology at the Crossings, and we're going to develop this is what a guy from Oxford says, developing hybrid ecclesial models for ecumenical spirituality in the 21st century, and that's how you write a dissertation, and they say, okay, you know what you're talking about. That wasn't what my dissertation was on, but it probably should have been. The image here is the tracks. I'm a big train guy, And so I'm fascinated by trains. People think I'm a little nuts about it, but I am. And I'm particularly fascinated at the points of intersection. How, particularly in Europe, when you're at these amazing train stations and they're crossing, well, these trains are coming into Central Station and they're crossing the tracks and they miss each other, but they're coming in on the same line. That's kind of where we're at in the church. We have a number of points of intersection. So that's the image I want to leave with you today. So the present landscape, you can read all this. I'm going to send this to you. Here's what you need to know about this. Go back one. There we go. A century ago, 90% of the world in the West was Christian. If you don't know that, that's the number, 9 out of 10. It shifted, by the way. The landscape of Christianity is not in the West, it's in the global South, where I serve. I happen to be the assistant bishop of the Diocese of Zanzibar in the Anglican province of Tanzania. And so the questions of evangelism, and I was listening to the guys who were talking about their reflections in Uganda yesterday, put it on steroids and you may get an idea of kind of what it's like there. It's very different. Where I serve in the Diocese of Zanzibar, it's 99% non-Christian. Only 1% of the population is Christian. That's an exception in the global South. So where I am is actually much like the rest of the world. Okay? So the changing face of Christendom is what you all are kind of struggling with. That's what I heard yesterday. Okay? And now, of course, that's the key, isn't it? The changing face of Christendom, because we all entered the church thinking we're going to be in Christendom, that the world and the church actually had at least a symbiotic relationship. And now we found out what? We don't. And except nobody told us. So what you need to know is that Islam is the fastest growing religion on the face of the planet. So that's something you need to be really clear about, what you're up against. And then the other piece is the knowns, you know about those guys. And they're not just in the United States, they're everywhere. They're particularly in Europe. And they're the second fastest growing group in the world. Not in the United States, in the world. And so we're becoming a minority. There's a bubble map I have about all this. It's too complicated to explain, but you're welcome to the PowerPoint. If you want it, we'll send it to you, and it's got the map on there, and you could play with it to your heart's desire. So this is where we are. People are getting off the train. They're getting off the train in droves. And this is the Christian train, and they said it was a nice ride for a while, but it's not pertinent. It's too slow. It doesn't go where I need to go. I want faster transportation. I'll take a jet. I'll take a supersonic train. People are getting off the train. They see our train, the traditional train, is way too slow. So we need a new ecclesial model, because the renewed efforts for evangelization have been well placed. So please don't be offended by what I'm now going to say, because you all used this term yesterday. But remember, I come from a different place, so it's not an offense to you. I think this concept of saving the lost is half the problem. As soon as you tell somebody that they're lost, you've now excluded them. You've left them out. What we're dealing with really, when you take those statistics to heart and you look at where you're serving, you're trying to find the missing. That's what you're really trying to do. You're trying to find the missing. And being missing, if you've ever had that experience, is all those things that we know people are going through: alienation and loneliness and all the things you talked about with the gangs. And it's all about being missing. It's about not being found on the map. That's a lot different than being lost. And so if they're God's children, they're missing, they're not lost. Lost says you're on the downside, you're the loser. You may not agree with me on that, but if you go into the wild, you'll find out that's actually the case. Are there models we can learn from on this? Yeah, there are. So there have always been ecclesiastical movements of the Spirit that have responded to the missing. What I'm saying today is not new terrain. Okay? What is different is that we seem less able to reinvent them, to recapture what they had and adapt it to a new season, to a new culture. You know this. Some of you talked about monastic spirituality, or the what did you call it? The mercy ministries. That comes from the Mendicant orders. Francis of Assisi. You all know the story of Francis, right? What did he do? He stood in the town square and he said, I give you everything I've had in front of the bishop and his father. I give you all the wealth. I give you my name. What's born of the flesh is flesh, and what's born of the spirit is spirit. And he goes out to San Damiano, and he rebuilds the church that's fallen apart, thinking that's really what he's supposed to do, but it was really about rebuilding the spirit of the church. So this experience is not new to the life of the church, and it's not limited to the Roman church or the Anglican tradition or the Reformed tradition. It's just the church. That's one of our problems. We segmented the church, and so now people go, well, which brand? And they don't see that as viable witness. They see that as divided loyalty. Okay, so again, we all know about Christendom. Started the Roman Empire, kind of tooled along until about the 5th century, needed a rebirth. Monasticism came along, that rebirthed the church for a while. Then we had structures. After the 5th century, we have enormous structures being constructed. Some of you know them as dioceses or judicatories, as we call them today. And then you had the religious orders that were not dioceses, that kind of wandered, like Patrick in the Celtic Church. They just kind of wandered and set up shop and evangelized and catechized. And these two models, they paralleled each other. Council of Whitby comes in the 7th century and says, you know what, we need everybody to be under the same style. And of course, they say, well, that was just when they established the date of Easter. That's what it looks like. That's not what's going on. It was about how do we get from universality, where the faith is shared, to uniformity. And that became the problem. Okay, Catholicity is not uniformity. And no offense to you guys in Reformed tradition, but that's also a misapprehension you guys make about that tradition. And I only know that because I get hit with that all the time. And I said, well, you're just not getting it. Universality is not uniformity. But to be fair, historically, that's what it became. So by the 5th century, the 6th century, when that happened, dioceses were, judicatories were powerful. They had money, power, all the things that you associate with it. And religious communities, like Francis, when he comes along in the 11th century, they're on the downside. They're not seen with the same fervor, the same. So what do? They decide they've got to get power. So the monasteries become powerful, as we see that in England. So what did Henry want to do when the English Reformation comes along? Henry wanted to disestablish the monasteries for two reasons. A, they had power, and B, they had money. Okay, so while the monasteries were a sodality and the dioceses were modalities, the monastics said, we need to become like those guys because we're being edged out. We all know what that's like, right? Say, look, I'm on the margins. I got to try to figure out how to get in. So I'll kind of look like those guys a little bit, but we'll adapt it, right? We'll extrapolate. We all do that in the church today. If you read Professor Jenkins from Baylor, The Next Christendom, he writes all about this. So you can read it, guy. He has some books for you to read that talk about this. Structures of God's Redemptive Mission by Ralph Winter. You guys all know who he is, I suspect. The Lost History of Christianity, 1,000 Golden Age of the Church, Middle East, Africa, and Asia, and How It Died, really important. And then this is a book that will make your brain explode, because it's by an Eastern Orthodox guy, Church in the Making, an Apophatic Ecclesiology of Consubstantiality. Say that 3 times fast and you get the book for free. But it's a really important book. Okay, here's the point, that jurisdictions are modalities. They tend to be static. They are on the part of the structure. Any institution, any structure has one prime mission. What is it? To safeguard the structure and to safeguard the institution. That's its job. Whether it's a hospital, a church, a government, doesn't matter. Any modality is to safeguard the very essence of what it is. Nothing wrong with that. You need structures, but remember, that's their mode of operation. Okay? So what happens is, sodalities get birthed in the church over time. So from the 10th century on, sodalities are birthed in the life of the church, and they constantly come through the cycle of the church. And the church structure goes, yeah, let's try to use those guys, and if we can't use them, let's get rid of them. Okay? So what you have about sodalities that's different is that they're mobile and deployable. They're not settled. Okay? They engage where the church structures are unwilling to go. Mission societies were sodalities. Why? Because the diocesan guys, the parish guys, the judicatory guys, didn't want to get on a boat and go across the ocean and put their life on the line. I mean, I understand that, but that's what they didn't want to do. But those guys want to do that, so let's let them go do that and go, yay, we're off of sodalities. Make sense? So that's how the church evolved. And so what happened a lot for these guys, these wayfarers, if you will, I like to use the image of, like, you're in the wilderness. I like to use the image of journey. We're all pilgrims. These guys went on a different pilgrimage. Went on a way different pilgrimage. Where everybody's going left, they went right. And here's the problem. They didn't really need a bishop and an overarching authority system to say, go do it. They were convinced, the Spirit led them, they had a vision, they went. And they put their lives on the line. Sodalities are important to the life of the church until they threaten the institution. That's the problem, okay? Ooh, how'd that happen? So, I want to say this, what the institutional church, which obviously I have some representation of given the outfit today, so I'm not an idiot. I know from whence I come. And I do understand that much of what I'm saying is counterintuitive to look in this way, but it's only based on 31 years of ordained ministry. The point is this. The church has never learned, the institutional church has not learned that modality and sodality are not mutually exclusive. They actually can be complementary, and what we really need at this point, where we are at the crossings, we need a hybrid. We need a hybrid model. It's not either or, it's both end. And that's really hard for us to get a handle on. So, here's some ideas for you. I'm going to give you an example of a hybrid that I'm associated with. So I talked about evangelism before, and none of you threw anything, so that's a plus. So here's another one for you. Get rid of parish. Don't worry about being in a parish anymore. It doesn't mean anything to anybody. Okay, first of all, where's Michael? Right? Parish is a geographical boundary that comes from the Church of England. That's where parishes come from. And in England, they mean something very different than what they mean here. So when you talk about a parish, it's not real. And I always called myself, and still do, I'm a parish priest first and foremost, because my parishioners. But my parishioners don't come from a geographical area. They're all over the globe. So we had to find the group. The group of guys that I work with is called the Anglican Union. We'll talk about that in a minute. We said we need a different model. So we came up, we adapted oratory. Oratory is simply a place to gather and pray. We didn't invent it. Philip Neri invented it in the 16th century. We'll talk about him in a sec. Oratories are places to pray. That could be inside, that could be outside, it could be sacred space, it could be secular space. It's a great leveler. It's a great leveler. What I like about it is, when you use the word church or parish, people have the association of a building like this. Some of you guys who have been in storefronts and in rough places and coffee houses, if you use the word church, people walk in and go, there's a whole set of expectations. This isn't a church. So we have words like parish and church that build in baggage that people go, I was looking for that. That's not what I'm looking for. I'm out. So we went to oratory because it's a great leveler. And it could be at a rec center, it could be at a coffee house, it could be at a school, it could be a blues bar, it could be in a traditional church. It doesn't really matter. It's a place to pray. Why that's important, and look, I'm Father O'Malley, going my way. This is not easy for me. The word church, you all know this, comes from the Greek kyriakonos, which means things belonging to the Lord. I mean, physical things that belong to the Lord, not people, the stuff of the church, the chalice, the vestments, they were kyriakonos. And that word becomes in the Old English kirch, adapted, and eventually becomes kirch to church. So when you talk about church, you're talking about physical things that that we say belong to God. It's the vestments, it's the chairs, it's the whole bit. If you don't have that, what's the point of the term, right? So the other problem is parish. It comes from the Greek para, adapted to the Old French, and that's a term people are increasingly put off by. And there's a whole bunch of sociological and painful reasons that have come out because of the scandals that people don't want to be associated with anybody who's a parish priest, right? So we went to oratory. Maybe not. There we go. So it's not a new concept. It started out in the 16th century, a guy named Philip Neri, who founded what's called the Oratorians in the Roman Catholic Church, but it's not just in the Roman Catholic Church. Anglicans and Lutherans have them as well. We'll talk about that in a sec. It was started out as a room to have Bible study and prayer because a bunch of lay people in Rome in the 16th century wanted to have Bible study and prayer in the midst of all the uproar of the Reformation, and they were told by the bishop they couldn't do it. So they went and rented a room, and they had Bible study and prayer. Sound like anybody you know? Okay? And that's how it started. Philip Neri was a layman. He wasn't a priest. Matter of fact, the institution said, if you're going to keep doing this, you have to become a priest, or else not going to let you do it anymore. And why did they want to become a priest? Because they wanted to control him. Okay, It didn't happen so well, fortunately. Not only in the Roman Church, in the 17th century, Nicholas Ferrer, who's a deacon in the Anglican Church, establishes Little Giddings. Some of you may know the poem Little Giddings by T.S. Eliot, part of the four quartets. It's based on this. And what happened was, you all know, Cromwell became the Lord Protector of the realm and outlawed the Anglican tradition in England. It was utterly illegal to have a Book of Common Prayer. You couldn't worship as an Anglican, and you could not be an Anglican cleric. So he's got a family estate out in the Midlands, Little Giddings. It becomes a place that anybody who was Anglican could come pray and come live and come serve. It becomes an oratory. What happens is, establishment finds out. What do you think they did? Read the poem Little Giddings, you'll find out. Okay. All of these were birthed when the church was in crisis. Here's the point. The church is in crisis. So we argue there's a need for another oratory. What we're trying to do is reclaim the idea of a lost modality. That modalities are going to continue on. They don't need my help. I mean, they do need my help. I'm part of a modality. I'm part of a diocese, so it does need my help. But part of what our efforts are is to try to decentralize and try to make it self-sufficient. Okay, so I do understand that. So what happened in 2018 is a bunch of Anglican bishops, seeing all these bubbles bursting, okay, came together and said, we need to organize something different. And so what they organized was an international confraternity of oratories, an international confraternity, a brotherhood and sisterhood of people to come together and pray all over the world. There's a bunch in the U.S., India, Africa, Latin America, okay? And it's open to anybody. You're in the Anglican Communion. We even have associate members who aren't Anglican, who say, that's the right idea. So the Anglican Union has a very real purpose. That's the purpose: propagate the gospel. That's it. And that happens in three ways, three charisms. And so they said, tell us what the three charisms are going to be. Number one, that we're going to be rooted in the historic faith as expressed in the scriptures and the principles of the Book of Common Prayer, because we're Anglicans. So you got to have a rooting. So scripture and the prayer of the church, okay? Secondly, service. So prayer, charism 1. Charism 2, service. I don't mean service as in, we're at the bar. Nothing wrong with being at the bar, don't get me wrong. I'm talking about very specific service, the corporal and spiritual works of mercy. Every oratory is grounded in that. Key. Thirdly, and most importantly, ecumenical spirituality for the work of unity. That we're committed to working together with other Christians under the banner of propagating the gospel, asking people to journey with us. Why? Because going forward, we believe if those numbers are correct and the population is diminishing in terms of Christians, therefore the resources are going to diminish. As the resources diminish, you're going to have less ability to execute the work of the gospel propagated. But if we pool resources and pool vision, we'll have an opportunity to actually be more expansive than if we just operate by our own silos. So that's what that spirituality is about. There's you all know about ecumenism, so I won't get that. So there's six principles for ecumenical spirituality. One is, obviously, first and foremost, it's based on John 17. Okay, I don't need to explain that to you guys. Why is that important? Because the world's fragmented. Second principle, ecumenical spirituality seeks to create relationships that are patterned after the Trinity. If the church operated with each other in a more Trinitarian context, the church ecumenically would be a lot healthier than it is. Instead, we operate by silos, and we're going to shoot missiles at each other because we're all about sheep stealing. It's actually not sheep stealing, it's just sheep trading. We just trade. Nobody's stealing anybody. Just trade. It's like the Major League trading deadline. That's really what it's like. Okay? So what this does, it undergirds the need for evangelization and mission. Principle 3, ecumenical spirituality offers the wider church a foundation of mission that's horizontal and vertical. That's really important. You have to understand the boundaries of ecclesiastical structure. God, Stephen. And secondly, you've got to establish kingdom structures. So you need both. Human structures, kingdom structures. That's the third, and you'll get this. How do you do that? Establish dynamic worshiping and missional communities. Spiritual formation is the foundation of all that you do, which is catechesis, and social ministry is a constitutive dimension to how you gather. It's not an option, it's a constitutive dimension to who we are. That's how the oratories work. Principle 4, that ecumenism is foundational to how we gather. That's when people come to where your oratory is, you guys say, we're in this to work with others. We're not in this to say, this is our silo and let's all be happy together. Okay? Fifth principle, ecumenical spirituality seeks to offer modalities and sodalities, a different way of thinking about the church. That's really probably the hardest thing to get across to people. It's not the Preservation Society. Most of us belong to judicatories that are about the Preservation Society because we're desperately afraid of going out of business. Well, if we continue that mindset, we will be out of business. That's the problem. The very nature of this oratory system is to try to widen the base, not narrow the base. Sixth principle, ecumenical spirituality is grounded in the expression of the Eucharist. I know that means different thing to different people, but well, I'll just leave it at that. The ecclesiology's got to be Eucharistic in that it's Catholic, it's uniting, it's calling people to become bread broken for the world and blood poured out for the world. Okay, that's pivotal. Why is this? And then, Stephen, I'm done. You'll be happy to know. This is an opportunity. This is important. So, I will read this out. This is an opportunity to engage in a responsive listening. You guys talked a lot about that while I was here. At least that's what I heard you saying anyway. To lively engage with humanity in a way they want to be engaged with. Okay? Right? They really do. Who said, somebody was saying that they were in the collar and they said, would you pray for me? People want that connection, even though they don't know what to do with it. Okay, so that's a way to engage them. It's also a way to follow the Holy Spirit. To go down the route of a sodality takes a lot of faith. I speak from experience. I left every traditional dynamic I know to join the Anglican Union. Okay, but I believed it was in God's time. Because why? Because Scripture tells me when the time is, and that the time is now. When you read all about the fragmentation of the church, and you look at Revelation and say, how is that not now? Somebody tell me how it's not now. What do we have? We have, since the liturgical reforms of the 60s, I'm going to use that as a, kind of put a pin in it. What do we've had? We've had confusion, contention, and conflict. That's all we've had. Okay, and we've had, you may call it revisionism, liberalization, etc. Maybe so, but all it's created is confusion, contention, and conflict that have been, hold on to this one, this is a board of serious people. It really is. Like, why do I need to come to that when I have that in my own family? Or I have it at my workplace? I don't need to come to your place for more of it. So this is kind of nutty. We believe, the bishops from Africa and here in the U.S., we believe that we're going to affect the course of the church at its core values because we have a model that already did. Philip Neri did that. Oratories is still part of that church. There's only 80 in the world in the Roman church. But here's the deal. They live their charism and they don't deviate because it works. And so we believe we can change the values of the church. Will I be alive to see how it shakes out? Probably not, because I'm an old guy. But my son will, and hopefully his kids. The ramifications for a movement of this at this point are you can't estimate. If this works, it'll be another Reformation, I think. And the fact that I got all that done in this amount of time is miraculous, even though I know it went over, so I'll stop there. But you guys can have this and read through it all, and there's actually a paper that goes with this. If you want the paper, you can have it. It's 26 pages, and it's got footnotes, and you go, oh, God, no wonder this guy went to Oxford. But anyway, you guys have been great. I hope that was semi-interesting or somewhat helpful, and I think I'm supposed to be quiet now. Oh.
Kevin, come sit with me, please.
This is DeRuda. He's like, he just pops out of nowhere.
Actually.
It's like stealth. He's the stealth. Oh, it's good to sit down.
That was amazing.
Yeah, it was a lot in a little time.
It was a lot in a little time. And one of the, there's
He
so
can
many.
sure talk fast, can he? He's not from Alabama, obviously.
He's from New York.
My wife's from Birmingham, though, so I hope that counts for something.
So there's a lot there and a lot to digest, and I hope that this inspires thought and conversation among us. What occurs to me is that about every 500 years, there it has been, not that this is predictive, but there has been a cataclysmic shift, a seismic shift in the world and in the church. And I hear you essentially describing that.
Yeah.
That we're in that moment.
I wrote a paper, this when I was at Oxford on that very point, and Phyllis Tickle wrote a book based on it. The point, what she missed, and what we all need to understand is that the big shifts happen at 500 years, and we're just, so 2017 was the 500th anniversary of the Reformation. We're just kind of coming out of that. The key is, what people miss is that there are mile markers along that path that say, it's coming, it's coming, it's coming. And the problem is, we've never seen the mile markers. And what I'm trying to say is, we have to get ready for the next shift. It's coming. It will be less than 500 years. It will probably be on the cusp of this one. COVID has accelerated everything that we would put out 25 years from now is now going to be 5 years from now. And so the key is to look for the mile markers. And of course, where does change happen in the life of the church? It always happens on the margins. It's not happening at the center. And that's why the Reformation was always so surprising to people. Whether it's the monastic reforms, the Great Schism in 1054, or the Continental Reformation. People were looking at the center, and what they didn't see were the margins. They didn't see the monastics on the margins. They didn't see the discord of the Eastern Church and how that needed to be integrated in the life of the West. They didn't see it, they didn't hear it, largely because of communication. And in the Continental Reformation, they thought, Luther was some guy just kind of in an ivory tower. But he wasn't. I should give John Calvin credit too, but I mean, Luther's the guy he's the guy with the door, right? That's what everybody remembers. They shouldn't have been surprised he tacked it to the door. If you heard what he was saying and how he was integrating with the people at the university, there were plenty of mile markers to say it was coming. John Calvin, plenty of mile markers say it was coming. In the English church, which wasn't really a reformation but a rejection, I know it's hard for some people on the Anglican side to hear, but wouldn't it have been different if the Bishop of Rome gave Henry the annulment? I'm not sure I'd be sitting here this way. So there's always mile markers that put us in directions.
I want to observe the time, but I know we have a couple of questions, and so let's go to them. Yes.
Probably, why did you bring this guy here is the first one.
Okay, now it's on.
There you go, David.
I really appreciate what you had to share with us, and it's confirming to me that the instincts that we're having are true, that there's a reality to, we need to do things differently. This may sound like a really dumb question, and I don't mean to be weird, but like, why don't you change the name to not include Anglican if it's going to be ecumenical around the world? And that's super naive, and like,
no, it's
why
not.
don't you undo all this hundreds of years of tradition? So I know that sounds really dumb to say that, but it's sort of like, well, there's this Presbyterian union for the propagation of the gospel, but we're not going to do it in a siloed way. That's just a naive question.
No, that's a good question. I think for a couple of reasons. Again, part of it is that this was organized under a group of bishops who have a particular identity. The interesting thing about them is that Anglicanism has a lot of different flavors, or the idea of being Anglican. And these guys fundamentally are principal evangelicals. They're not Anglo-Catholics. I'm actually one of the exceptions. And so they thought, in their mind, it's inclusive because of how they function. Also, the second piece is, in Africa, where this was birthed out of, you have to have an identity. You've got to be able to say, the source of that is here. But I could see a day, David, where the name could change. It's probably not today, but I could see where it would. It's only 2.5 years coming up on 3 out of the box. So I think it will morph at some point.
But to your point, with regard to how new the Anglican Union is, the sodality is almost timeless. I mean, English Christianity,
Yeah.
which predates the Roman moniker, was very diverse in its life and in its expression. And this is what I see and hear coming through this revival, if you will, of the sodality.
Absolutely. So you all have been, you know, the Celtic kind of model has kind of had a rebirth, and you've seen these beehive huts. They're not huts, they're made out of stone that you see in Celtic models. Those were they were called oratories. Remember, these are at outposts, and if you've ever been to Ireland, even in the west of Ireland, I mean, it's some rough terrain, you know, and it gets really cold, and there were only a handful of shepherds out there, and yet there was a cleric who was there to minister to them, and they gathered in this little oratory. And so the interesting thing about it, it was just the church Catholic. Remember, we don't get into a title about the church till 1054. So we have 1,000 years of just being the church Catholic, period. The Great Schism happens, and then we get into, and then by the time of the Reformation, well, then we're into isms. So I think you're right, David. The challenge now, if this is correct, on the sodality model, is to morph out of ism and into that wholeness to restore it. So maybe this is the first step.
Stephen.
Thank you, Kevin. This has been phenomenal. And the level of detail adds weight and momentum to what you're describing in terms of what's going forward. Like, you're connecting this to this huge history.
Yeah.
And I appreciate that very much. I have 2 ideas that I'd love for you to help me sort of coalesce. One is the idea of like the church in exile versus the church in power. And then that's connected to a question of, man, is there any hope that the church might somehow achieve something where we don't abuse the power that then is given to us because of God's Spirit working to renew the world? Like, I've got huge hope that could happen. Do you see that ever happening in a way that we don't just muck things up and have it?
Yeah, I do. So I'll take the first question first, and then I'll double back to, in terms of the exile piece, it's important that the church in the margins, often the church in exile, always have a witness. Otherwise, the established church will never be held to account, I think, because power corrupts, and absolute power. I mean, it's just, sadly, the church is made up of a bunch of humans that we all happen to belong to that club, so you run that risk. The good news is, to tie into your second question, is that there are people that actually offer a witness to say that it doesn't have the final say. And I'm going to tell you quickly about one of those people. His name is Peter Joe. He's the Bishop of Malek in South Sudan. If you know about South Sudan, it's one of the worst places on the face of the planet. It's a country that's about 10 years old. It's the newest country, I think, still, according to the United Nations. It has very little law and order. It's poor beyond poor. It's born out of religious strife between Islam and Christianity. And it's exceedingly tribal. Peter Joe is the Bishop of Malek, which sits in the Boer region in Jonglei State, which is in the southwest by the Nile River, which is how they kind of transport each other. He is under enormous persecution. He would hate the fact that I'm talking about him because he hates when I do this, but he's under enormous persecution from the state. His life has been threatened, I can't tell you how many times. Right now he's at the refugee camp for Sudanese in Kenya, visiting his flock who have fled the country because of their Christian, and they are threatened in their very lives. Peter Joe is a guy who's on the margins, and he speaks to the institutional church about righteousness and justice, and he does it with humility, not with judgment. And that's the key about that institutional piece, that if you don't do it with humility and you do it with self-righteousness, no, it'll always be about power. And Peter Joe does that. And you would think that that would be something that people would admire about him, and yet it only gets the institution really upset with him, and including, I mean, I know a lot about it, and I won't bore you all the details, but he's not only persecuted from the civic structures, he's persecuted even by members of his own tradition. And yet, he stands tall, and he stands in the faith. And I've met 3 saints in my life. My grandmother, my father's mother, never had a bad word to say about anybody. Here's what if she had thought ill of you, and you were saying it, she would say this: well, Kevin, you need to pray for them, because some people would find complaints about heaven. And if she said that about you, you must have been the devil incarnate, because that was really harsh. The second saint, in 1977 at seminary, I met Mother Teresa. When asked how she was visiting, how she was enjoying her first visit to the United States, she said, not much. And people went, what? She says, well, at least in my country, people know how poor they are. And if you want to have silence come over a room of 300 seminarians real quick, give that line. And then the third saint is Peter Joe. And all 3 of those people were people who loved the church, but spoke on behalf of those on the margins. So I think that's how it interplays. I don't know if that helps you, Stephen.
Friends, this is a very fascinating conversation, and I think puts our ideas into another frame of reference, a context for us to be discerning as we move forward together. Kevin, it's a delight to have you here today and to serve with you, and appreciate what you've offered for us this morning.
Well, thanks. It's been a pleasure. And